I recently watched the movie 8-Bit Christmas, a movie that's unapologetic about being an unofficial, albeit updated version of the classic, A Christmas Story. A Christmas Story being a film that followed a character named Ralphie, while the adult version of him reminisced about the Christmas where he wanted a very particular gift for the holiday.
There it is. The holy grail of Christmas gifts, the Red Ryder 200-shot range model air rifle.
And we have the same thing in 8-Bit Christmas, where Neil Patrick Harris playing Jake Doyle also reminisces about the Christmas where he also wanted an updated version of a gift.
You know what? Today is your lucky day, because I am now going to tell you the story about how I got my Nintendo.
The characters now talk about their trials and tribulations as they work towards receiving their respective gifts. All the while, there are some detours that detail the finer moments of being a kid from their decades. While the movie itself was fine and unoffensive, and even got a few well-deserved chuckles out of me, I couldn't help but find the whole thing odd. Even though this film is set a bit before my nostalgia prime childhood, as I was still a toddler at the time of this movie's setting, it should still speak to me better than a movie about a desired BB gun set in the 40s. After all, 8-Bit Christmas is about something much more relevant to me and just about resembles the time period in which I grew up. And yet, it doesn't. Ever since, I've been trying to figure out why this is. And the answer that I landed on has to do with what these movies are about. 8-Bit Christmas is a movie that captures the spirit of growing up in the late 80s and 90s. Just like in the movie, I also used my bicycle to traverse the labyrinthian streets that made up my suburb. I glamorized the possibilities from winning Scout fundraisers. And of course, I was in awe of video games. But while it captured these ideas on a surface level, it didn't capture the feeling of being a kid. Not as well as A Christmas Story anyway. And while I think this is a testament to what A Christmas Story was able to accomplish, I think it also speaks to a failing of 8-Bit Christmas. So how did A Christmas Story accomplish this feeling of being a kid again? What secrets was it tapping into that 8-Bit Christmas is apparently unaware of? And the answer to that is simply, it made a very clear distinction between the child and adult worlds. In A Christmas Story, this demarcation exists in nearly every one of Ralphie's vignettes. There's the time where the kids get flicked to stick his tongue to a flagpole in winter, based on nothing more than a childhood code that's meaningless to adults.
I triple dog dare you!
Schwartz created a slight breach of etiquette by skipping the triple dare and going right for the throat.
And that's just as well because there's also the recognition that conversely, adults use guilt as a tool that's just as meaningless to kids.
But those who did it know their blame. Don't you feel remorse for what you have done?
Adults love to say things like that, but kids know better. We knew darn well it was always better not to get caught.
We famously see this in the scene where Ralphie tries to advance to the adult world when bonding with his dad over fixing a tire.
What are you doing here?
Mom said that I should help.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, sit down here. Squat down.
Only to be shot back down.
Oh.
I said the word, the big one, the queen mother of dirty words.
What did you say?
And we of course see it in every adult's response to the gift he wants, all of whom think that he can't handle the responsibility.
BB guns are dangerous. I don't want anybody shooting his eye out.
You'll shoot your eye out? My mother must have gotten to Miss Shields. There could be no other explanation.
This really is what made this movie as emotionally impactful as it was. Virtually every one of Ralphie's conflicts is either directly or indirectly affected by this barrier between the adult and child worlds, and the result of which captures the essence of childhood. But this demarcation between the adult and kid worlds in 8-Bit Christmas isn't clear, and at times is purposely blurred.
Silence, children of Batavia. And Coach.
Sure, these one-off jokes are functional on their own, and they even made me laugh, but jokes like this speak to a problem of the movie. They conflate the adult and child worlds. The result makes for a good comedy, but not a movie that reminds me of what it was like to be a kid. This blurring of the lines can best be seen in the primary obstacle for these characters. In both these movies, the parents are aligned on why children shouldn't have access to their sought-after toy.
Apparently, video games have been doing all kinds of strange things to children in Japan. One little boy had a brain aneurysm and stuff oozed out of his nose.
Just like the adults in A Christmas Story are all aligned on why a child shouldn't be able to get a BB gun.
You'll shoot your eye out, kid.
But while these scenes appear similar, there's a key difference. This obstacle blocking Ralphie from getting his BB gun is coming from a legitimate adult concern that he'll hurt himself. Something Ralphie doesn't even consider until he has to because, well, it was true.
Oh my God, I shot my eye out!
In other words, the parents' concern is proven to be a rational one. Compare this to 8-Bit Christmas, where the obstacle isn't a rational fear from the parents. Instead, it represents an exaggeration of the technophobic panic that was going on at the time, a plot device that has more to do with the commentary on the silliness of parental reactions at the time, more so than it has to do with adults enforcing that barrier between them and the kid world.
What are we prepared to do about it?
We should ban it! Ban it!
Ban it! Ban it! Is modern technology taking over our lives?
In other words, it's a nod to adults in the audience who now realize they were right to ridicule their parents for this mass hysteria. And the failure of 8-Bit Christmas to distinguish between the adult and kid worlds can be seen in how this character reacts to this obstacle just the same. It's through pragmatism. He starts by trying to win the Scout fundraiser that's offering the NES as a prize.
This year's first prize is a brand new Nintendo Entertainment System.
And while he succeeds at this through taking advantage of market demographics and wins first prize, he only later finds out that first prize was switched, something that was out of his control entirely. And so with this plan not working, Jake Doyle will go on to plan an Ocean's 11-like heist where the kids all pool their money together after selling baseball cards and go buy it themselves while on a field trip.
Open the door. All right, go.
You're the guy, yes, Doyle! Red Dog, this is Bluebird. Approaching the mall, over.
Hopefully you're realizing just how adult these plans seem, but it's even more clear when we consider what Ralphie did when all seemed lost. He asked Santa.
Santa. Yeah, Santa.
It's true both characters are scheming to obtain their prized gift, but they're doing it in completely different ways. While Ralphie is plotting to get his BB gun through childish, unrealistic means, Jake Doyle is doing it through, well, unrealistic means as well, but cinematically friendly, unrealistic means, not childish.
I'm going in. Keep them on the phone.
And when you consider these differences, the contrast is clear. One movie is editorialized from the perspective of a child, and one movie is editorialized through the perspective of an adult. And that really is the problem I have with 8-Bit Christmas, and it's the reason I think it doesn't speak as well to me as The Christmas Story does. It might make me chuckle, roll my eyes at how things were, or roll my eyes at what the movie has resorted to do to get a sense of action, but the blurring of the lines between the kid and adult worlds decisively doesn't remind me of what it was like to be a kid. And it's clearly demonstrated in the end of each movie, where Ralphie is found sleeping with his new toy, while the adult Ralphie narrates that he dreamt of being a cowboy. 8-Bit Christmas uses A Christmas Story as a template, but only to subvert expectations. In 8-Bit Christmas's version, Jake doesn't get his NES. In fact, it even references the scene where all seemed lost for Ralphie until his father found one last gift wedged against the wall.
It was the exact size and shape of the box I'd held in my hands not 3 days before.
Well, there's always next Christmas. Hey, that's funny. What's that over there behind the desk?
But instead of it actually being the gift Jake wanted, this was simply to misdirect audiences. Instead, the movie acknowledges that it pulled out the rug from under us.
Light bright.
As we soon learn, he had to work for one summer to get his NES.
Never got it as a present. I had to work for it.
Well, work again. He goes on to explain that he did get one surprise from his dad, even if it wasn't an NES. A fort. Flash forward to present day and the family is having dinner. The father from these stories is now dead, but Neil Patrick Harris realizes the true meaning of his story from his daughter.
That was the Christmas you and Grandpa found your thing.
He gained more from his father than a plaything that Christmas. His father taught him how to build things just like him, and Neil Patrick Harris will go on to pass this on to his daughter just the same.
You think maybe we could borrow some of his tools and work on the fort tomorrow?
Yeah.
Okay, that is kind of sweet, but that doesn't change the fact that something is lost in this ending, and that substantially changes the impact, because what A Christmas Story is able to communicate is what it's like to be a kid, and in the end, that really is what I'm getting at. These changes might communicate the more pragmatic, less childish view of being a kid, and it might have a more direct message that's kind of nice, but it's also less of an indulgence of the past. And that's something A Christmas Story did masterfully. It wasn't saying possessions are all that matter. It was saying these objects, even if they are mass-produced, are emotionally charged with our fondest memories. And that includes memories of our loved ones, childhood naivety, and the feeling of a time when things were more simple. Which is all to say, A Christmas Story's ending is just about as good as it can be. There's no need for a lecture on the true meaning of Christmas. That's all encapsulated in the gesture of appreciating these memories.
Next to me in the blackness lay my oiled blue steel beauty. The greatest Christmas gift I had ever received or would ever receive.
In other words, this is a movie about nostalgia that appreciates nostalgia, whereas 8-Bit Christmas seems to want to repurpose it. And this difference really is key. Not only does it fail to bask in these memories, but it also carries with it that sense of pragmatism that the rest of this movie suffers from, and it ends up making the whole thing that much more removed from what A Christmas Story was able to accomplish, to make us feel like a kid again. So why am I, a video game YouTuber, talking so much about 2 Christmas movies? Well, it got me thinking about nostalgia and its purpose. And that's lucky because we're inundated with nostalgia right now.
This is Nintendo Switch Online plus expansion pack.
Well, Nintendo might have ruined it. Anyway, this isn't too surprising. It's said that this is a medium obsessed with its own history, and that's hard to dispute. Gamers are proud of the games they like. Some they like so much that they become part of their identities. And this isn't a bad thing. In many ways, it's understandable. These aren't just pieces of media that are moving to us. They're frequently also pieces of media that we work hard to master and we become personally attached to. The result of which is the industry recognizing this personal identification and a commodification of this nostalgia. But the way nostalgia is being monetized in video games right now, it isn't in itself bad or evil or outlandish. I myself even partake in this guilty pleasure, but I do think it misses the point, just like 8-Bit Christmas does. Nostalgia is supposed to be an indulgence of the past and how things were. And that's why I think I'm finding it so bland and heartless to treat nostalgia of today like it needs to have a point. That is, it's not good enough to remember these things in their own right, but rather, calling on these memories should have some kind of utility. Whether that utility be something to set up expectations only to subvert them, using it as a reason to modify its mechanics, even if it is well done,
my brain just starts thinking in Dragon Quest terms.
Or in many cases, just seeing these characters we love go on new adventures. In some cases, they fight the same bad guys we recognize. In some cases, they fight a monster of the week. Or rather, a monster of the $30 DLC. To be clear, this isn't an instant criticism where we can dunk on games without doing any more work. But the only point I'm trying to make by pointing this out is to say, nostalgia can be more than this. And this got me thinking, what game would actually accomplish what I'm seeking? What game uses nostalgia for more than creating action figures for the director to repurpose, easily digested pablum, or uses it as commentary? What game lets us simply bask in our memories and remember how things were? And there are some great candidates. But the game I want to talk about here is one I've, perhaps ironically, thought quite a bit about since I played it close to its release in 2017. What Remains of Edith Finch. This is a game that doesn't just use its nostalgia to ground its world or make humorous callbacks. Its entire content is about nostalgia and what's lost to time. In it, the titular character Edith Finch goes through the house she grew up in and discovers the memories and stories of her relatives who either died or went missing here. And she does this by entering the rooms of these people that have been sealed off and now stand as well-preserved museums of who they were. In each of these rooms, Edith will find some artifact that tells the story of who these people were. And we get to experience these stories through playable flashbacks of their final moments. And I think this really is what's so powerful about this game and its use of the mechanics, because they speak to what nostalgia comes from. This is best put by sociologist Jean Baudrillard, who says, objects are used to reset ourselves outside of time. These objects, he argues, are a way of escaping from everyday life, and no escape is more radical than escape in time, none so thoroughgoing as escape into one's own childhood. And therein lies the brilliance of this game, because what Baudrillard describes is exactly how we interact with this game. We explore objects that are temporally charged, and some of those times that we escape to are just different years, but most are to our childhood. And I think this is the reason it fits into this discussion. We see this kind of thing all the time in video games. Objects themselves are scattered around these virtual worlds, and upon better understanding their context, we get a sense of the game world's history. And just like those games, What Remains of Edith Finch also takes advantage of the medium by turning us all into archaeologists, using these items to tell ourselves a story about the game's past. But what we don't often see, even from other walking simulators I've played, is the emotion that What Remains of Edith Finch is able to communicate through these items. Because once we find the artifact that tells us about these deaths, suddenly these objects have meaning. Not to the larger world or its lore, but they tell us a romanticized story of who these people used to be, based on a snapshot of what they got out of life. And that's what I find so interesting about these objects that are meaningless to us when we first enter a room. They're initially seen as clutter that helps us to identify a path. But once we know their context and what they meant to this person, these items all accomplish something important. They link us not only to this individual's past, they link us to our past as well. Perhaps not the exact same events, but at least the principles of childhood. I've wanted to talk about this game for almost as long as it's been since I originally played it, but I think I better understand what it's doing now, because as I've gotten older, I'm starting to better appreciate just how valuable these memories are to me. And even though they're digital, these items in this game tease out these memories for me just as they do for these characters. Finding Barbara's horror comic about her death gives context to the Hollywood memorabilia all around her room and reminds us of what it was like to romanticize fame. Discovering Sam's story about his brother's death gives context to all his aeronautic paraphernalia and reminds us of a desire to explore. And even baby Gregory's objects become emotionally charged when we remember having an imagination that would run wild. These objects are what make these rooms feel lived in. And I want to emphasize just what it's doing here. It's not tapping into a cookie cutter nostalgia where we see a brand name or out-of-date logo and associate it with our childhood. These are vague references to a collective past, but they aren't tapping into a feeling of childhood. This is a game not about objects in themselves, but the memories these objects hold for us, because they bring us back to what it was like to be a kid. And that really is the essence of this game, to have us recall these childhood memories. And so these nuances of childhood are represented here, whether it be remembering entertaining ourselves when we were sent to our rooms with nothing more than our imaginations, trying to pump our legs so hard that we loop the swing, or getting that adrenaline rush when walking down into our creepy basements. All of these small moments that we probably haven't thought about since are now coming back to us through these items. And I want to give the game credit for keeping it as simple as it is. We don't collect this knowledge for a larger purpose. We don't uncover a secret ending as a reward for finding these objects and figuring out their meaning, and we aren't here to uncover a mystery. In fact, the mystery that's presented is sealed up, never to be discovered.
Things I can't explain, but that I need you to try and...
Edith, what are you doing in here? It's mine. Edith! Mom, you're gonna rip it, let go!
It's normally something that would frustrate me, but not here, because that contrast helps identify the actual point of this game. We're here to uncover these stories, because these stories themselves have value. And I think that's also demonstrated through the kinds of stories it's telling, because there's a pattern to these stories. Where the adults have grounded stories that lack imaginary elements to them, we see that the children's stories of their deaths contain whimsy and fantasy. Whether it be Gus controlling the storm that ended up killing him, or it be Milton drawing his own secret door to escape through. In fact, these childhood stories contain such fantastical elements, the truth behind Molly and Barbara's deaths are left mysteries. And that's because they're so heavily editorialized by childhood whimsy. Molly is said to have been eaten by a monster under the bed, and Barbara is said to have been eaten by the great Hollywood monsters of the early days of film. Contrast these to the memories of the adults' deaths, and these grandiose elements are nowhere to be found. Sam dies from a tragic accident on a hunting trip, Walter dies from getting hit by a train, and Dawn dies from an illness. This is the distinction between adulthood and childhood. This contrast can best be seen in a character who's only mentioned in passing, Sven, Edie's husband who died building a slide that resembles a dragon. And while we know the actual cause of death, we get this line that shows the desire to romanticize his death.
When Edie told people Sven was killed by a dragon, she could also have said he was building a dragon-shaped slide that collapsed. She could have, but she didn't.
And this really is the most important line in the game to support its theme. Just like Beauregard says, nostalgia is a radical escape, and none is more thoroughgoing than the escape into childhood. And we see this exemplified by Edie because Edie is wrapped up in this more than any adult character. There's a realistic account for all these deaths, but Edie, a character who's 93, won't report it that way.
Edie told me all Barbara wanted was to be remembered. As absurd as that comic was, maybe what Edie saw was a happy ending.
Instead, she'll retreat to her childhood and say the death of her husband was caused by something grander than everyday life, just like the deaths of the rest of these children. This is why Edith says this line.
Edie's side was always easier for me to understand. But the older I get, the more I can see where my mom was coming from.
There's two competing points of view here, and they're influenced by time. The childhood and the adult. The childhood being represented through Edie's point of view, and the adult represented through Dawn's point of view. Where Edie wants to exaggerate these stories and turn them into unrealistic yarns told from the lens of childhood, and Dawn who wants to move on from these stories but keep these people in her memories. And this desire to return to childhood is the tragic flaw of another character as well, Lewis. A character who commits suicide by decapitating himself in the workplace, an act he commits while daydreaming about being a king, parading through the crowds of his subjects. This vignette is as important as it is because it perfectly encapsulates the dichotomy of adulthood versus childhood. After all, Lewis is a character who's in between these two stages in life. He's 21 years old, and while yes, that technically has him qualify as an adult, that age is right in the middle of the range between 18 and 24, where adulthood comes with an implied training period. And this transition period is important because it shows the path Lewis has gone down. He rejects adulthood and retreats to childhood, and we see this through his fantasies that now resemble Edie's stories. And while many have spoken about the mechanical brilliance of this vignette, and they're all right to praise it as much as they do, it's in viewing it through this lens of adulthood versus childhood that makes it as impactful as it is. After all, this is why Lewis's death has fantastical elements to it, unlike the adults who have died. These elements make his death resemble the deaths of his younger child relatives. The difference between these deaths, however, is they're intruding into his reality while he performs the duties of one of the worst parts of being an adult, having to work a job. The contrast we are feeling through gameplay is Lewis retreating to his childhood while trying to ignore our adult responsibilities. This is what we're feeling when we assume the fish guillotine is going to strike at the beat of the music.
He no longer spoke at the cannery, but his chopping was as reliable as ever.
But it doesn't. It's the contrast between the adult and child world expressing itself. And it's also communicated in one of the most depressing moments in this vignette, because while the music and parade for Lewis builds in the fantasy,
he talked about starting a band. And he was always humming something.
there is a moment where that fantasy is broken, and soon we're all confronted with reality. Suddenly, there are no crowds celebrating, only mountains of dead fish. There is no music, only the rhythm of the cold machinery. Our only choice is to look towards the crit path, which is a conveyor belt, promising to steadily take us further into this one direction, towards the cruel reality of adulthood. And when the music picks up again and we return to the daydream, there's a tangible sense of relief.
The palace would be packed with his companions.
That is, until we realize it will mean Lewis's doom. And this contrast is encapsulated in how Lewis's psychiatrist saw him as a grown man.
Mrs. Finch, your son was a kind man who will be missed by all of us who knew him.
And who I assume is Edie, who placed the crown on his gravestone, saw him as a child who saw the world as larger than life. So while this is an astoundingly relatable vignette, I worry that it might have been removed from the larger context of the game and the discussions around it. This entire vignette is about the contrast between adulthood and childhood, but the reality here has him stuck on a linear path towards adulthood, something he doesn't seem to be able or willing to do. And at its core, that's what this game is about. It's not the kind of walking simulator that has us picking up objects and taking note of them to turn us into detectives. This is a game where not only the objects capture nostalgia from our childhood, but the mechanics do as well. Whether it be playing with a music box or playing with a pop-up book, so many of this game's mechanics are repurposed to remind us of the way things were. And while we do this with just about all the characters, the most tragic of which comes from Edith herself, because we only get a few moments to experience her childhood through the mechanics like we do with the other characters we take control of. It only happens twice, once in the moment that almost all kids can relate to, where they use their hands as a sail to guide their whole arm by sticking it out the car window, and it next happens in the moment where she sets the spores of a dandelion free, except this one's cut short by reality.
But she started getting sick a lot.
And in this way, Edith's childhood is cut short before her death. This is the game expressing its other primary theme through the mechanics. Our childhood is inevitably consumed by time. And while it might feel like it, this game isn't just about saying being a kid rules and being an adult sucks. It's an understanding that time is different in our childhood. And while we might want to return to it, we simply can't. We're all on a one-way street, away from our fondest memories. However, I don't think it's all so grim. What we learn from Edith is we should be aware of the joys of our childhood because that connection to ourselves is a genuine one. This is, after all, why she decides to pass on these stories to her son after struggling with this question.
I just want to meet you and tell you all these stories myself.
And being able to relive them through this game is a tangible strength of these mechanics. This is a message that's brilliantly told through Milton's flipbook, because Milton is one of the few characters that likely doesn't have his story editorialized by Edie. We get to see his story based on how he views himself, and in that sense, it's one of the most personal stories in the game. He's a kid who loves the skill he's grateful to have. He loves his skill so much that he escapes into it. This isn't just a kid's view of himself in those extremely brief years between your formative years and adolescence, where the world seems conquerable. And this isn't just a home movie of the good times of his childhood. The fact that we experienced this story through his flipbook that we control through our mouse movements is really at the core of what makes this so powerful. Because not long before finishing the flipbook, I realized it was going to end. And of course, I knew that would mean he would go missing. And that realization filled me with despair. I tried to slow it down, but when I do, it loses its meaning because it no longer resembles a cartoon. And I tried to stop it, but that just means I'm no longer seeing it at all. And this resulted in me realizing I can't control it. These moments are going to run out whether I like it or not. All I can do is appreciate the experience. And before I knew it, the flipbook only had blank pages left, implying that there was more to this story, but it was cut short here. This game is a reminder that time isn't a force or foe, it's simply a part of our experience. And I think that's what's so refreshing about What Remains of Edith Finch. It's about nostalgia, but in an honest way. It's an indulgence of nostalgia, and it also understands that it's an important part of who we are. I thought for a while about how to structure this script. I first wanted to bookend it with a story of one of my favorite memories from my own childhood during my formative years. But I realized capitalizing on that nostalgia would also be missing the point. It's my memory that's important to me, and trying to make it more important than that would make it something else. And I think that's what I realized from this. If there is a message, it's to say these memories from childhood don't need a message. They don't need to be repurposed, and they don't need to be used for commentary on something larger. We can't control or relive these memories, but we can appreciate having them. And realizing that is, in its own way, empowering. It's what A Christmas Story captures, and it's what Remains of Edith Finch teaches us. So I'm not going to share my story with you. Not here anyway. If What Remains of Edith Finch is a reminder of anything, it's that I just need to be able to appreciate that I can be in touch with these memories at all. Because to remember these moments is to briefly re-experience the principles of childhood. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. As a little bit of behind the scenes knowledge on this video, I had this video all ready to go up on Christmas Eve and a whole outro wishing you all a happy holiday, but this site makes it almost impossible to be a creator these days. It's through the help of my amazing patrons, a group you can be a part of, that makes it so much easier. To all of you, thank you. I also want to thank Griffin116, Grant Vogel, Faisal Shaker, Azala, Hans Homan, Master7, Aaron Potter, Monochrome Only, Furious George, Drawser, James Burgett, Sergio Proxy, Percival, Jan Berenz, Jeremy Barnes, Oyuyu, Joshua Tokarski, and Simon. To all of you, thank you, and stay safe.